I read a lot of demands and expectations from the Muslim community asking why are the Muslim states not taking certain actions against Israel or any of its allies. So where do you think the way that Muslim states are behaving, where does that come from?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it ties in very well with everything else we've discussed. I would argue that the inaction comes from a number of factors. Number one, that they are secular states. They adopt a largely secular politics, which means that it's not tied to moral considerations.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah, today we are with Dr. Uthman Badar. Dr. Badar is the editor and research operations manager at the Ummatic Institute and a student of Arabic, the Islamic sciences, and continental philosophy. He recently completed a PhD in philosophy at Western Sydney University, centered on a critique of the conception of secularity and the legitimation of secularism in liberal political thought. He has also been active in da'wah and apologetics over a long period. So, thank you, Dr. Badar. Brother Uthman, as we've known each other for some years, probably about more than 10 years. And I've always enjoyed discussing things with you. We have not met for a long time, but it's good to meet with you again. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Wa alaikum salam, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I equally enjoy our discussions.
Maybe before we start, can you just tell us a bit about what is the Ummatic Institute and what is your role in that institute?
The Ummatic Institute is a relatively young research institute. So you can think of it like a research institute or a think tank that focuses its research efforts on questions of, how should I put this, the sort of central questions, political, economic, socio-political questions that affect the Ummah, globally speaking, centered on the aim. So our vision is to progress towards a unified Islamic civilization and the restitution of the khilafah. But the focus at this stage is on research and thinking, because that, we believe, is the starting point. And so issues that are relevant to that whole space is where we focus our research efforts. My role is research operations. I kind of manage commission papers and manage them, edit, and sort of get that research out. So from this A to Z process of finding the right topics, getting the right people, and then moving along the process. We also do events, so it's not just research and papers. We had a conference last year in Istanbul in June of 2022. In fact, next year we are having one, inshallah, in Kuala Lumpur in July, I believe this time it's July, yeah. So in fact, there's a conference and a workshop in July. So, different sort of research papers, research-focused events, some conferences. But I guess the differentiating point is that the focus area is Islamic political topics, if we can call it that. In fact, if I just can end this on the note, Ummatics, which is a neologism coined by Dr. Uwaimir Anjem, who leads the institute, and he's got this very nice line where Ummatics is to the Ummah what politics is to the polis, right? And so the idea is that it's a more indigenous way, a more Islamically grounded way of speaking about our collective issues. So anyway, that's a little.
So the Ummah is to the Ummah as what politics is to the polis. So you're looking at the application of the system and thinking of governance for the Ummah as what is to a city state or the polis. Would that be fair?
Yeah. Although even more broadly, so politics in the original Aristotelian understanding is the management, organizing of the public affairs or the collective affairs of the polis. That's it. Polis is the Greek city-state, and everyone's got there's the oikos, there's the internal household, which is where we get oikonomos from, economics. It's the management of the household internally. But when you step out into the public sphere, there are collective affairs of the city. And that's the name Aristotle came up with, politics, just to refer to organizing the public affairs of the city. But I think that the point is, so yeah, it's Ummatics is about organizing, managing. Siyas is another word. Organizing, managing the collective affairs of the Ummah. It's at that very broad level. But part of the reason of going with a new word is to emphasize this idea that when Aristotle says politics, he means something specific that's tied to a particular worldview. And although we still, in the modern world, in the modern sort of liberal democratic vernacular, they still use politics, but it means something different. For example, for Aristotle, the act and the task of politics was a virtuous task. In fact, it was one of the most virtuous tasks because you're going beyond the individual sort of selfish, your own thing, to think about the affairs of the people. And for him, it was tied to morality and tied to, the individual and collective struggle or attempt to achieve virtuous characteristics, right? Whereas in the modern world, although they still use the word politics now is kind of like, how do you manage the affairs of the nation state? Not really tied to morality in any specific way, and not really tied to any particular moral ends as well. So you see how it's the same word, but it means different things. So part of going with the new term is to say, well, we have our own understanding of what it means and the value and the obligation and the grammar of concepts that comes with organizing the affairs of the Ummah is a unique one.
What is interesting is that Aristotle, as you say, looked at politics in terms of coming together with morality, but we now look at politics, whether it's national or international, as being defined and driven by self-interest. How does Islam fit into this whole equation of morality and self-interest? And there's also this argument that morality should not be a constituent part of politics because all of us have different moral values. So should morality be part of politics as returning to the Aristotelian way of looking at governance?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And I think this is good to understand this in two steps. The general answer would be obviously any worldview, any way of life will look at its organizing of collective affairs through its own metaphysical and social lens. But what's happened in the Western tradition, if we can start there, I think two moments are important because Aristotle's view is actually dominant for 1500 years, maybe longer than that. The idea that morality and politics go together. The first major step away from this is in sort of the late Renaissance period with the likes of Machiavelli. And I think this is important because although what happens later on in the modern world is different, but this argument is there. So Machiavelli's argument is not that we've got so many different cultures, how are we going to manage? Because he's still dealing with a very, very dominant Christian culture. It's not a pluralist culture in Europe in the 15th century. So his argument is that the whole morality thing, tying politics and morality, pulls back the efficiency of politics. It makes it harder, right? And so politics can be a lot more efficient and a lot more effective. So this is the instrumental argument. It can be a lot more efficient and effective if politicians, statesmen, don't have to worry about, or can be, flexible with moral concerns, which are sort of more the domain of religion or the priests and things like this. Now, having said that, Machiavelli is not someone who cuts off morality entirely. His moral sort of objectives are in the ends. So the ends are still meant to be moral. It's just that the means, and this is where we get the idea that the means justifies the ends, comes from. So that's one step in brief. But the other step is very important, is the one that you alluded to, which I would say comes in the 20th century, really. Actually, I'd probably make maybe 18th, 19th century with Locke and with John Locke and these other people to a certain extent, but really it's the major theorization is in the 20th century, even in the late 20th century with people like John Rawls. So the political liberalism tradition is 1980s, 1990s, really. So the second step is the one that then says, well, how can we manage diversity? If you tie morals to politics, which is about managing the collective affairs, if the collective affairs include more than one culture and morality is tied to culture inevitably, then what do? Now, obviously, people like John Locke and he in his time was dealing the pluralism was just Catholics and Protestants, which is still Christian, but you've got this sort of conflict that comes up. But nevertheless, the same idea is pursued more vigorously in the 20th century because now you've got genuinely a lot more cultures. And so that's their argument. Now, from an Islamic perspective, however, from the Islamic worldview, there's really no way to separate the two. There's really no way to separate the two, or to make the Machiavellian argument, or to make the modern, say, let's call it the Rawlsian argument. I'll come back to quickly respond to the Rawlsian argument, but I think the point to emphasize is from an Islamic perspective, the question is very, very definitively answered when, for example, the Prophet ﷺ ascribes the task of politics, siyasa, to prophets, right? In the famous hadith in Sahih Muslim, where he says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, كانت بنو إسرائيل تسوسهم الأنبياء. Bani Israel, the children of Israel, would be then their siyasa, literally, تسوسهم, their siyasa would be done by prophets. And then he goes on to say, however, there's no prophets after me, but there will be khilafah. So he says the prophets carried out siyasa, but after me there's not going to be any prophets. That task of siyasa will be the task of the khulafa, who are the deputies or the successors of the prophets. Now I don't have to say more on that because the task of a prophet is eminently moral, right? It's like they're there to teach virtue and so on and so forth. So from Islam perspective, we can't do that. My last point would be responding to the point about if there's multiple cultures, how do you do it? That's a very good question, and it comes from a good place because it comes from a place of fairness. How can we be fair if there's, let's say, 10 different cultures and they've got 10 different moralities or moral frameworks, and you want to tie one of them to the collective affairs? The liberal argument is if you take one, Christian or Muslim or any other, the other 9 are rendered second-class citizens. That's the liberal argument in a nutshell. The problem that they don't acknowledge is there's no way to carry out politics without it being tied to some form of culture, fundamental values, fundamental ideologies, call them what you like. And so the problem with the liberal worldview is it presupposes that you can abstract from all these cultures and carry out politics from some place of neutrality. But you cannot. So what actually happens is that liberalism, capital L liberalism, as a culture in itself, and some people will call it a religion, but at least as a culture, as an ideology in itself, its morality gets tied to politics. So now you've done the same thing. Those 9 or 10 other citizens are second class. And we can actually appreciate this from a phenomenological perspective or a practice perspective. As Muslims, think about how you feel in the public life of Australia. Do you feel like you have as much of a say and as much, are you heard as much as liberals are heard? for example. There are many cases where we see that there are, whether it be double standards or whether it be the difficulty of having yourselves heard in the same way that we're told that we should be, is just not there. So therefore, although the ethos of trying to be fair is a commendable one, there's no way out of this. Some culture has to be at the center of politics. And therefore, I would argue, to finish this point, that it is a much better approach to be honest. This is the difference between Islam and liberalism. Islam is honest and recognizes that someone's got to be at the center. It says Islam will be at the center because it is the truth, and will recognize the difference of others, and we will organize and manage that in a fair and equitable manner. Liberalism says no one's at the center of this, where in fact they're at the center. So it's a dishonest approach, and you're all equal, but we're not, right? And in the end, they're imposing their ways, and in the name of a legal equality, there is quite clear actual inequality and inequity in many different forms.
So what we have now is that liberalism has been universalized, right? And the argument is that the views of the liberals is something that is acceptable and is accepted by every culture and society. And that is how they're able to create themselves as the foundation. Is it possible for Islam to be that foundation, and to be for the Islamic worldview to be universalized for everyone else to accept it?
So I think the key there is the first premise, which I think is a claim. I'm not sure it's true. So obviously liberalism makes the claim to universalization. It makes the claim that it is a sort of a universal principle or a universal ideology that everyone can accept. And in fact, this is Rawls's argument, that we can have an overlapping consensus. So there will be a key ideal, like say human rights, which liberals affirm because of their own reasons, maximization of utility, maximization of happiness, sort of secular ideals. But Christians can affirm it based on their own deeper reasons, which is that humans are created in the image of God, and therefore they're all equal, and they all have rights that are given by God. And Muslims can do the same, and Jews can do the same, and atheists can do the same. But we've got a key principle, which is a liberal principle, but everyone's agreeing to it. So there is definitely that claim, but I would argue that in practice, it's not. The actual universalization, first of all, it takes place with a lot of imposition. So, anyone can study how the Catholic Church, for instance, we don't have to go as far as Muslims, within Western Christian culture, it took at least 200 years for the Catholic Church to come on board and say, okay, yes, democracy and liberalism are in line with Christianity. And this happened as late as the 1960s with the Second Vatican Council. Which means for 150, at least 150 years, Pope after Pope was saying liberalism and democracy are anathema. They are unchristian, right? Excommunicating this person and that person, and so on and so forth. So what that means is it's a struggle. It's politics at play. It's not as if it's not theoretically at the level of ideas. It's not as if there's a Christianity and liberalism go hand in glove. No, there's a massive struggle, and in the end, obviously people are going to have different opinions, but in the end, I think there's a strong case to be made that the Catholic Church just capitulates and goes with the flavor of the day. After trying to stop that flood for so long, it says, well, there's no point in doing this. And it's a pragmatic move, and therefore a political move, more than it is an ideological or moral move. So I don't think liberalism is universal. People either come on board because it's dominant, it's hegemonic. If we mean universal in that sense, yes, we can grant that. Or some people still don't come on board in that sense, but then they're like, So, so many Muslims, I'd argue most Muslims, are still at where the Catholic Church was at originally, saying, no, hang on a minute, we're not liberals, we have our own thing. So what happens to them? They get branded extremists. It's not as if the liberal response is, oh, you know what, we're multicultural, we're about everything. So look, come bring your arguments to the table, and we'll see how we can fit them in the big plan. That's not the response. The response is, you guys are extremists. You guys are fringe elements. You guys are this. You guys are that. And then there's soft power and hard power measures used. Again, politics is used, force is used to get you to acquiesce to the status quo. So that's why I would challenge the first premise. And the answer to the second question will be obvious then, that I don't think Islam can be universalized in that sense. There will always be people who adhere to their own views. But I think we can make a universal case for Islam that would be attractive to many people, both in terms of them voluntarily converting to Islam, but also many not converting, but being content with having Islam lead, the collective affairs of society, as opposed to liberalism or socialism or other alternatives.
Maybe this is a good time to ask you to define what is liberalism and what is secularism then.
Okay, again, these are significant questions that have a large literature attached to them. But at a brief level, and again, the part of the problem is there are theoretical definitions, and then there's like in practice what goes on as well. And then there are deeper debates, usuli debates, about whether we should go with the theoretical definitions or the in practice definitions. So in theory, liberalism is, I should also say that my expertise is in secularism. I can speak about that all day. And although liberalism goes hand in glove. Anyway, so liberalism, I would define liberalism in theory as the worldview centered upon the maximization of freedom. But as I say that, I would say that this is granting to the liberals probably more than they deserve to be granted, because that's what they claim in theory, but the practice is very, very different. And without going into too much detail, we can look at the difference. So the theory is that it's about maximizing human freedom. In practice, I would say the human in that claim originally, which means in the 17th, 18th century, was explicitly the European Christian, even the male. So it was a very particular being, whereas human was being used. So obviously there's a long tradition of racism that goes hand in glove with liberalism there. So we can bring them together, and I would actually define liberalism as something along the lines of the ideology which claims to maximize freedom for all, while in fact maximizing freedom for a very specific set of people to the exclusion of others. Secularism, which I can speak to with a larger degree of authority. So secularism, again, the popular definitions are that it is a form of politics. So secularism can be defined at the level of ideology, at the level of politics. But anyway, in the popular imagination and in the imagination of the liberals, secularism is merely about the separation of church and state. Okay, but that idea has been critiqued thoroughly by numerous scholars, showing that is not the case. What I do in my thesis is argue that secularism is a worldview, but also a form of political organization that subordinates religion. Okay, so there's two very different things. Saying that it merely separates religion from politics is one thing, but even if you start there and you actually have a look at what that means, and how it's done, I argue you will end up at this idea, this realization that secularism is about the subordination of and disciplining of religion. And when you say it like that, that is very, very clear, and it shows why anyone who comes from a religious perspective will not sign on to the secular project. So that's a broad level, and I'm not sure how deep you want to go, but we can have a look at different aspects of that. But that's how I would define liberalism and secularism.
Especially, I think if the separation of religion from the state results in the relegation of religion to your personal practice in your own private space, then, and that politics or the state has control of your private space too, then you are relegating and subordinating religion to the state. How has been, so you talk about the system for the Ummah in terms of how we organize ourselves. How has that been taken up by the Muslim Ummah, whether in the West as where we are, or even in Islamic societies?
When you say how has it been taken up, you mean the idea
Yes.
of Islamic governance? I would say that, well, I think in the Ummah, generally speaking, the idea of Islamic governance or the caliphate, the khilafah, has always been strongly established, because first of all, it was there in practice for so long, and even when it's been eradicated in the start of the 20th century, that's not very long ago. It's 100 years. And as it was eradicated, this is in reference to the demise of the Ottoman Caliphate, for the next 20 years at least, the Ummah was mourning, seeking to understand what happened, seeking with some efforts to revive the institution, which brings us to the 1930s and 40s. And at that point, 1930s and 40s is the point at which most of the well-known Islamic movements arise, whether the more politically oriented ones like the Ikhwan al-Muslimin with Hassan al-Banna, or even the more apolitical ones like the Tablighi Jama'ah. It's the same period, which is an indication that they're responding to the common background, which is a very significant historical moment in which the sort of umbrella institute of the Ummah has been dismantled. So, and now the point of mentioning that is obviously with these movements, they've continued forever in different forms, some, divisions and splinters and whatnot. So it's always been there. I think if we look at the present moment, or the last 20 years or so, I would argue that there is a very strong sentiment for Islamic governance in Muslims everywhere. But I use the word sentiment carefully. I choose that word carefully because I'm trying to differentiate sentimentality from strong conceptual grounding, which leads to action. So arguably, when an individual or a community conceptualizes something and adopts something as a solid concept, it leads to action. Depending on there can be some other obstacles in the way, but when it's more of a background sentiment, then it can tend to be just be there in the background. So if I ask you, what do you think about the caliphate? Oh yeah, that'd be a great idea. Muslim unity would be really wonderful idea, but how's it going to happen? There's a number of ideological barriers in the minds of people that think it's just not feasible, can't happen. America's too strong. Muslims can't do this, and they can't get together. So I think that's where we're at, but that's also an indication of where the work that needs to be done. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on our own people, on the Ummah itself, to address those mental obstacles, so that sentiment can be brought forward in the form of a strong concept that leads to action. And that trajectory of that happening, I think, definitely has been positive from at least the 1970s and 1980s onwards. Definitely the trajectory is in the right direction, but there's a room for a lot more work there, and I think that's the heart of the internal struggle in this space.
A few years ago, there was a group that claimed to be the caliphate, and it resulted in, from my personal observation, in the word khilafah becoming a bastardized word, right? That it becomes such a negative term. Do you think that the community still feel comfortable about using the term khilafah, or do you think that they are looking for something else so that they do not get pulled into that discussion of whether they're supportive of ISIS and Baghdadi or any of those violent conception of the khilafah?
Sorry, who do you ask about? You said they before that. You mentioned
So
who are you asking about?
So does the community feel comfortable using the term khilafah, especially
yes,
because
okay.
it has been used by these groups?
Yeah. I got that part. I think the impact of that whole historical moment is complicated by the fact, first of all, it's not as if before that the caliphate was a great rosy term that you could just use, right? There's a long Orientalist history of blackening the concept as a theocratic dictatorship that did this, and this, right? So we had that. Of course, those are sort of deep historical things, whereas when something comes to the fore in your face, as it did in 2014, I think it was 2014, 15, it's made a lot more prominent. So definitely, I think the ISIS project muddied the waters, with help from the Western media, of course, because they ran with that by all with intent, it seems. So definitely, I think that it's had an impact, but I wouldn't over-determine or overestimate that impact for two reasons. Number one, so we can look at the Muslims and we can look at the wider community. I think there's been more of an impact on the wider community, but the Muslims, like 99% of Muslims, saw through ISIS for what it was, right? So if I can see through this group and beyond its claims, I'm not going to attach, just because it used this word, I'm not going to give that credence any more than, so in the claims of ISIS, not just the caliphate, it's Islam itself. It's saying this is what Islam is. But it's not as if the Muslims are going to go, oh, you know what, Islam now, that's muddied. It's not. Rather, they'll say that is not Islam. This is what Islam is. Likewise, this is not the caliphate. This is the caliphate. So I think Muslims, there has been an impact, but it's low. And I think in the wider community, there's probably been a relatively greater impact because they're not able to make those distinctions as clearly, and they were always told, there's an extremist element, and it's this, and it's this large or this small. So there's probably been more of an impact there, but nevertheless, even that, I wouldn't overestimate it because, the outlying nature of ISIS, the exceptionalist nature of ISIS was, I think, clear to everyone. Because, like for example, who else comes remotely close to doing anything what they did? Like no one. Although now it's been regurgitated and it's being used as like a boogeyman where Hamas is ISIS and this is ISIS, and it's become like a paragon of evil, previously occupied by the Nazis and Hitler. So, but nevertheless, I think like discerning people on non-Muslims can see through the propaganda. But end of the day, it's part of our work to continue to make those distinctions and clarifications. I don't think it's a massive issue that that kind of a thing took place.
So if you look at how ISIS, again, I do not want to give them so much talk time or credit, but their attempt to establish their version of what the caliphate should be was a violent overthrow of a government. How do you see this, your Ummatic project, to is able to develop that sense of the Ummah and also that Islamic governance and khilafah?
Yes, well, absolutely. This is one of the, I think this is one of the distinctions between what ISIS was claiming and what not just Ummatics, but everyone claims, which is that the caliphate is not something that you can be imposed on the Ummah. It's not like me and my friends get together and say, you know what, my mate gave me the bay'ah, I'm the caliph now. Everyone else, what are you guys doing? Like, please line up. So, every other Islamic political movement, I think, recognizes that point. Although there are some degrees of difference between how much they require of buy-in from the Ummah versus, you know, buy-in from people of influence or power, or the own movement itself. But definitely in Ummatics, we strongly emphasize that this is something that has to come from the Ummah. It has to come from the Ummah, has to be based in a very strong realization on the part of the Ummah that this is what we need and that this is what we ought to work for. And therefore, so much of our work is about, is in that ideational, conceptual space. You know, that's where you need to really make inroads, if you will, so that people adopt this idea and this core as their own. Which again, I think most movements working in that space recognize that. It's just a difference of degree, and whether or not, for example, in some cases, there's a little more scope for what I think are shortcuts, where it's like, because we haven't got a sufficient response from the Ummah on the ground, and now we can go for something like a coup, right? But even in those iterations, there's still a significant requirement, some requirement that you need buy-in from the Ummah. But definitely from the Ummatic perspective, that has to be significant. There's no room for shortcuts and this or that. It's really got to be a natural, there's got to be a natural birth, if you will, right? Where the idea is being taken up more and more in the Ummah. When I say Ummah, obviously the Ummah is at levels, and there's different approaches here. Some movements work directly in the masses. Our approach is more to work directly amongst people, people who have various forms of influence, which is to work indirectly on the masses. So by people of influence, I mean intellectuals, academics, imams, creatives, policymakers, politicians, right? That whole layer of people who are the ideological / conceptual leaders of the masses, right? Because obviously there's another layer of influential, which is like generals and armies and rulers. That's a different layer. Who also you also need to take the da'wah to them, no doubt. But I think that's anyway, that's a difference of approach. But definitely the grounding in the Ummah has to be very strong for this idea and this project, and that's the first and the primary objective.
So you're looking more at the scholarly or the ideational elites rather than the state elites, which may include those in government and military. So those are not your focus right now. Your focus are those who.
Yes, they're not the focus right now.
Yeah.
Not because they're not a focus point, but because of the understanding that the ideas or the concepts come first. They're more important than the power. So if you focus on the power before the idea, then that's effectively saying it doesn't really matter what the people think. We just need the power. We can move on with this, which is an approach. But I don't think it's a good approach, because it's like it's not a grassroots approach. Your roots are not going to be strong. And therefore, for approach that works off strong roots, we will work off the intellectual influentials, and at a later stage come to the power influentials, if you will, as well, because those classes or those elite, I think, are more required for the transfer of power than for establishing the idea amongst the ummah at large. Yeah, to some extent, obviously, there's some people overlap. So policymakers who can think at a policy level are important, not because they have power, but because, you know, they think policy. So they'll probably be in the first category. But nevertheless, as I said, I think this is one way of separating these two categories of elite. And it's just a case of where do you focus first and for what reasons.
Has there been any response from state elites, whether in I see two different possible responses. One is, you and I, we both live in the cultural West. So how will this cultural West respond to the project that you are carrying right now? And also importantly is, how do Muslim states or states run by Muslims respond to what you're trying to achieve?
I think that depends a lot on the approach that's taken. Obviously, any political power, entity, regime will not take well to a political struggle against them. So if you engage in political struggle, they will respond. And usually repressive regimes, the like of which we have almost uniformly across the Muslim world, will repress those type of efforts. However, we don't have, that's not part of our repertoire. And to the extent, and therefore, if your work is primarily intellectual, ideological, you're unlikely to ruffle their feathers in the same manner. Having said that, I think it's inevitable that some form of struggle ensues at some point. That's the example with all the prophets. That's the example of the Prophet ﷺ. And so in the larger, longer term frame, it's not possible to, you know, bring any form of radical or serious change in any society. It's not just Muslim world, even the West. Like you don't achieve serious change without some form of struggle, some form of repression, some form of pushback. But I would argue there are better and worse ways of navigating this reality, right? So, for example, it's very much possible to make the mistake, I think it's a mistake, this is obviously arguable, debatable, to make the mistake of prematurely engaging in that type of political struggle. And premature here means you don't have support on the ground, you don't have sufficient intellectual or ideological buy-in from the people, but you're attacking the regimes. So in a nutshell, I think some form of struggle is inevitable. That's the lesson of history, but there are better and worse ways of navigating that. And I think that's what differentiates different approaches on this matter.
So will Muslim state elites right now need to see this project, and I'm not just talking about Ummatic, but I'm looking at the whole idea of galvanizing the Muslim community into a sense of Ummah. Should they feel threatened by it in the long term? Or is it possible to do what the Prophet did with, say, like Abu Sufyan, where he recognized the role of the existing leadership and to support that existing leadership too?
Yes, and that's an excellent example. And I think that substantiates the point. So, although it's important to keep in mind, Abu Sufyan, if I understand your allusion correctly, you're alluding to his acquiescence at the conquest of Mecca. Be that as it may, we have to appreciate that Abu Sufyan stood strongly against Abu Sufyan, Abu Jahl, Abu Lahab, strongly against the Prophet in Mecca. So that's what I mean by saying that the struggle is inevitable at some level. But there are better and worse ways of doing that. Now, I think that's a very good example you raise of an approach where you establish a sufficiently strong foothold on the ground, and you establish your forces such that someone like Abu Sufyan is able to look at that and say, this is in my interest. This is, there's no point in pushing against this anymore. So definitely that's I think an ideal approach. I think that's the best approach. However, that does come into play at a certain later point of any longer term strategy or game plan of reinstituting Islamic governance in the Muslim world. Because and at the conquest of Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ has already established something of an Islamic polity in Medina. And it's those forces, it's the cumulative impact of those forces that Abu Sufyan is able to see and say, you know what, there's no point in pushing back anymore. So that's definitely got to be part of the picture. And I guess that shows that both before and after you establish you gain actual power, there are better and worse ways of doing this. And I think it's also, my last point here would be definitely the Islamic principle is to minimize violence and bloodshed, whether in war or anywhere else, whether in war or in political struggle, is to minimize that. That's what we see the Prophet doing in the Fatah Makkah. He could have come with 10,000 soldiers and just said, anyone that stands in the way, I will destroy them. But he took efforts to try and minimize that. So he sends his uncle Ibn Abbas Al-Abbas, not Abbas. He sends Al-Abbas Ibn Abdul Muttalib radiallahu anhu to go and speak to Abu Sufyan and show him the army, give him a good look of how big the army is, right? So anyway, I think that's fairly well known, and I think we need to see what those type of strategies mean in practical terms in the 21st century.
Most, if not all, of the Islamic or Muslim states right now are governed by a certain set of political elites, with the religious institutions now being part or within or subordinated to the state elites. Will you then say that Muslim states now are secular?
Yes, I'm not in two minds about the fact that the vast majority, in fact, I'll probably argue all of them. But this is an important point as well, that saying a particular state is a secular state doesn't mean they're all exactly the same. There is different forms of secularism, even within those liberal states that everyone would agree are secular. So French secularism is different to American secularism, and in fact, in the literature, they are dealt with as different typologies. There's a typology, and we speak of French secularism, American secularism, English secularism, Turkish, Indian. In fact, I'd say these are the main five. So you've got Anglo secularism and French with the sharp contrast. You've got Turkish. The reason Turkey is a typology of its own is because it's almost the reverse of France. So French separation is a lot more strict. In Turkey, the Diyanet is part of the power. It's kind of, but it's still, and no one discounts the fact that Turkey is a secular state. And then you got India, for certain reasons it's counted as different as well. So in the same way, I would argue all of the Muslim countries are secular because they've all subordinated religion to the interests of the state and to their sort of form of politics. Yeah, now some may push back there on examples like Saudi or Iran, but that's a debate. They get into certain details. But yeah, my answer to that would be the vast majority, if not all, the Muslim countries are indeed secular for this reason.
So will you then count the actions of these states, whether Saudi, Iran, Morocco, to be the actions of Muslim societies, hence with the tie-in of Islam? Or would you argue that these are actions of secular states and secular state elites?
Yeah, so here, the latter, but this is where, when we talk about actions, it depends. Are we talking about the actions of the state? Are we talking about government policies, or are we talking about something that is being done at a communal level, the individuals, the Ummah? If it's the former, then definitely these are the actions of secular states. Because the state is secular, because the government adopts a secular approach, their policies are secular policies. Although I think this is more of a terminological difference. I'm not sure it makes a big difference how we classify particular policies and whether they're Muslim, Muslim or not. Defining a policy as Muslim or not, I don't think is a worthy exercise. It's probably more about whether a particular policy is Islamic or not. And if it's Islamic or not will depend on its particulars seen in light of the Quran and Sunnah. So in some sense, what I'm trying to say is judgment of the policies can be done separately to judgment of the state as a whole. In other words, there can be a secular state who adopts a series of policies, the vast majority of which are secular, but some policies are Islamic, which just means that they would, they're Sharia compliant, for example, even if they don't come from a Islamic regime, so to speak. For instance, if a particular state's economic policy to do with public property is to deal with those items, those things and items which Islam classifies as public property, electricity, for example, al-ma' wal-kala wal-nar, as per the hadith, then it would be an Islamic policy, at least an Islamically a Sharia compliant policy, even if the government was whatever it was. So I think that distinction can be used as well. But this is how I would pass that anyway.
Given that our discussion for secularism and politics and self-interest, there's this huge elephant in the room about the way that Muslim states are now acting or reacting to what's going on in Gaza. Where do you think their current seemingly inaction stems from? Because I read a lot of demands and expectations from the Muslim community asking, why are the Muslim states not taking certain actions against Israel or any of its allies? So where do you think the way that Muslim states are behaving, where does that come from?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it ties in very well with everything else we've discussed. I would argue that the inaction comes from a number of factors. Number one, that they are secular states. They adopt a largely secular politics, which means that it's not tied to moral considerations, right? Even though some of the language is moral, just as it is with the US. The US will, the US spokesman in their press conferences and the president will always make claims to human rights and doing this and doing that, but the policy it's not designed on moral considerations. It's designed on political, economic, geopolitical interests. So the Muslim status is the same, right? Even when they are taking certain actions that seem to be moderately favorable, it's because that form of politics demands it, right? And that's because if the majority of my people want to see me do something, that's a political calculation. It's not a moral calculation. I need to appease the people. So I may issue a strongly worded condemnation of Israel, which with a lot of moral language, right? Or I may take some other steps, but these steps are significantly short of what I should be doing if, in fact, my compass was Islamic and or moral, right? Islamically moral or moral by any means, any other moral framework, the steps will be very different. So, number one, these are secular states engaging in secular politics. When we talk about, so this is obviously if we're talking about Saudi and Turkey and Egypt and Jordan, we're talking about foreign policy, not so much domestic, if in the context of Gaza, or regional politics. So we might say that it's not just that the politics is secular, they're responding to geopolitical realities. That's largely part of the calculation. And all of these states have a certain understanding of where its interests are at in the region and how it needs to relate to Iran and Saudi and this and that. And that's what they basically, the core of the policy is based on that, with certain adjustments made for unintended occurrences, right? People are rising up, protests are happening. What can we do? How can we let out some of the steam of public discontent and so on and so forth? So that's one consideration. The other thing I would add, which is hand in glove or hand in hand with this, is the established phenomenon of the nation state. Contra the international relations, if it was done along the lines of the Ummah. So this is a major area where we also need a significant change and significant theorizing about how international relations, regional relations would look if the primary unit was the Ummah as opposed to the nation state. And in fact, because it's relevant, one of the things we do at Ummatics is a monthly or bi-monthly colloquium, which is to bring in academics with expertise in certain areas to talk about these issues. Our very most recent colloquium was on this point about the place of the Ummah in international relations. We had a couple of experts from Egypt, in fact, Dr. Nadia and Dr. Mehdet, who spoke to this. And the video is up on YouTube for anyone that would like to watch that. But I think that's another key factor, that following the First World War, but definitely established by the Second World War, the entire world operates with the nation state as the primary unit. And that's why you talk about national interests. Even when from a human perspective, not even an Islamic one, from a human perspective, it just seems wrong. And you see this in Australia. You can see it in Australia, where politicians will talk about Australian national interest and this and that. So if some Australians, are stuck in Gaza or in some other conflict region, that's their responsibility. Everyone else can, whatever happens, it doesn't really matter, because we're dealing with this type of a framework, which is an eminently sort of unhuman approach or non-human approach to these type of problems. Anyway, so I think those are the two key factors: secular politics, secular understandings of international relations, and the nation state as the primary lens through which this geopolitics is being maneuvered.
How will this current situation in Gaza be different if we are a collective Ummah?
If we are, sorry, what was the last part?
If we work as an Ummah with our own system of politics and governance, how will this be different?
Well, I think it would be extremely different. Although sometimes it's hard to look at these type of hypotheticals, because I think the starting point would be different if that was the framework. You wouldn't be in such a bad situation. But nevertheless, let's assume it's the same starting point. But if we're working collectively, then I think it would be very different. Because what you do then is you mobilize your collective resources to the problem. Now that could be what you actually do in a given situation. This is the task of politics, and it's a difficult task. You have to see what are the options and what are the consequences. So at one level, a sort of a more I don't want to say extreme, but one side of the spectrum, let's just call it, there is military response where multiple Islamic states come together to, again, another spectrum, either just defend Gaza or to deal with the root of the problem and liberate Palestine as a whole. Okay, but when can you do that? How can you do that? This all depends on very particular situations, and there's really no point in this regard dealing with overly sort of hypothetical scenarios. But even short of that, there's so much else you can do. So, let's say we kind of agree that if we're going off the current status quo, the military option is a difficult one because it's going to lead to America and then sort of like World War III scenario, for example. Even though I don't think it would, but I'm putting it out there because this is a common kind of pushback. It's like, oh, you want to deal with the problem by creating a much bigger one. But short of that, there's so much you can do. Like the Muslim countries could come together and just take economic actions and diplomatic actions that would have a significant impact, right? Expel the Israeli ambassadors, recall their ambassadors, cut economic ties, cut military ties. And if multiple countries did this, that's a very, very strong message. And then because there's reliance, it's not just, and this is again the work of geopolitics, of a very interconnected globe. So it's not just the Zionist occupation that you're dealing with its backers. In fact, the backers are the real power, the US and Europe. But the US and Europe rely on so much of what you do. You rely on them, but they also rely on you, right? Stop selling them oil. Stop exporting significant items. So just the economic lever, or the economic lever is such a strong one. So yeah, economic policies, diplomatic policies, and then I would probably add very, very what's the word, sort of concrete or specific or targeted military policies. I think you can do a lot, short of even, short of what the Ummah sentiment is, which is really that this has gone so far now that it deserves a strong military response.
I think that my personal view is that if there is a collective Ummah and those who participate against the Palestinians know that there is a collective Ummah, it is highly unlikely that it will go to war. It's easy to bully someone who's really, really weak. But even if you see that someone is not as strong as you, but there's some strength, you will think a few times before you want to pick on them. So just the fact that the Muslims are sufficiently strong, even if they're not as strong as the others, I think that will be sufficient deterrence against any of these actions, which means that it will not lead to military, and I think that there'll be a better chance of peace if we are seen as being strong too. When we look at Gaza, and I read a lot of responses from those who support Israel, a lot of the response comes from this feeling that it's not so much that they support Israel, but they are against Islam. And because they are against Islam and they see that Israel is acting against Muslims, then they throw their support for Israel. There's this argument that they make that Muslims or Islam is inherently violent, and that Islam has bloody borders. So that, for example, that is an argument that Huntington made in 1993, I think. And there's all these claims about if you have Muslims in small numbers, or if you know them individually, they're okay. But the moment that they are sufficiently numerically significant, then they will cause problems and they will be violent. How do you see that? Do you see that it is a fair argument to make, or is there some other way for us to understand that?
No, this is just I would dismiss these as Orientalist tropes, not because politics, Islamic politics, as any other politics, doesn't involve the use of war or violence, but because the exceptionalist narrative that Islam is more violent, it's excessively violent, it's barbaric, that's just a function of Orientalism in the West. In the West, that's just a function of Orientalism and their own politics of creating enemies, portraying the other, the quintessential other to the European, which was the Turk or the Muslim, in a certain light. So that really would be my response. But the question also touches upon, I guess, well, there's a critique. There's a secular critique against religion per se, and Islam is prominent amongst that. That religion is more prone to violence, right? And although this was made about Christianity in origin, but Islam has always been looked at not just as equally violent, but as more violent, right? As you articulated. But this part of the secular story also has been debunked quite strongly by various scholars. One of the most direct books that does this is by William Kavanagh, I think 2013 or 2012, published by Oxford University Press. It's called The Myth of Religious Violence. And that directly tackles the origin story of secularism. This is why it's so important. The idea that religion is exceptionally violent is part of the origin story of the advent of secularism. It's like saying part of my identity, part of my very identity is an understanding that you, Zulfikar, are a violent person. So how I'm going to always look at you like that, right? That's a complete hypothetical, but in the case of secularism as a worldview, as an ideology, as an approach to life, it's inbuilt that religion is prone to violence, and Islam in particular is a accentuated form of that. As I said, this idea has been debunked thoroughly by, well, let me briefly mention the fact that there's been no shortage of violence in the secular age, the 19th century, the 20th century. Not only has there been no shortage of violence, there's been an acceleration of violence that in most cases has nothing to do with religion. Right? Of course, the World War I and World War II are classic examples. Israel is a classic example of that as well, the Zionist occupation, and then there's so many other examples of that. But not only that, even when you go back to the origins of where this idea comes from, the idea comes from the fact that, the story is that Europe was embroiled in very, very bloody wars of religion in the 16th and 17th century. And secularism came as a solution to that. It put an end to all of that by privatizing those theological debates that had no end to them. They were intractable debates about whose God is right and what the scripture says, that Protestants and Catholics were killing each other over, right? Because that's what happens in religious difference. You can't debate it, you just start killing each other. And secularism came and put a stop to that. That's the story. And you can imagine, if you buy that story, there is no scope for salvaging religion out of this, except, of course, a secularized form of religion, which is privatized and keeps to itself and the rest of it. But again, scholars have shown, including Kavanagh and others, that even the empirical facts, the historical facts used to establish this are completely don't support this. And it's a much larger debate, but just I'll mention one thing. If you look at the war, if you look at what became dubbed as the wars of religion, i.e. the idea that Catholics and Protestants were fighting each other, what you actually find is in many cases you had so there were cases where Catholic empires or estates are fighting Protestant ones, but you also have cases where a Protestant state or empire is on the Catholic side and vice versa, right? Which just refutes the hypothesis and shows that the wars, like most other wars, were about politics more than they were about religion. So anyway, so it's a much larger topic, but that whole understanding has been critiqued quite solidly. And if you remove that, the idea that Islam is an accentuated form of that also falls by the wayside. What remains then is talking about, well, what is the place of violence or war in Islam? But that's a separate topic, I suppose.
So if you look at the arguments made that, well, we had like the Iran-Iraq war, all the tensions among Muslim states. These are not necessarily religious tensions. These are political tensions of secular states. Would that be fair?
Yes, yeah, and it's the same kind of thing, right? So just as the Protestant Catholic conflict in the 16th and 17th century is being just dubbed as wars of religion. We're not saying religion has nothing to do with it, but to make the primary factor religion is to make a particular claim. And when you look at the historical facts, they belie that claim. Similarly, in the 21st century, the Shia-Sunni conflict is overplayed with these examples and other examples. So, for example, Saudi Arabia and Iran, why are they always at loggerheads? Oh, Sunni Shia. But every Sunni, I would argue every Sunni or 95% of Sunnis know that Saudi Arabia does not represent Sunni Islam. Right? It's a secular state. From its inception, it's been, looking for the right word and not to use too harsh a word, but it's been working for, slaving for or agents of Western colonial powers, from the very first Saudi state, the second one to the third one. But leaving the history aside, even today, like no one can disavow or negate the strong US influence on Saudi, right? What is that? Is that part of Sunni Islam that the neo-colonial powers dictating your foreign policy? So in the case of Iran, it's a lot more complicated because they claim, and a lot of Shia Muslims believe that it represents Sunni Islam, Shia Islam. But I think I would argue that if you look at the particulars of how it acts, it doesn't do that at all. In fact, there's a good example of, I think it was Azerbaijan, where not too long ago, where the policy of Iran was explicitly against a Shia population in Azerbaijan because that was in their interests. So these are secular states acting as all the other secular states act, but in fact there's works on this as well. There's a recent book published in just 2023, in fact, called "The Imam and the Caliph," or "The Caliph and the Imam," by, I think it's Tabayasin. People can Google the title of the book, "The Caliph and the Imam," and it's looking at this dynamic. And the author concludes roughly along the same lines, that a lot of the times the conflict is along political, economic, geopolitical lines, but it's given this religious cover because that's part of the secular DNA, the secular ideological DNA, to presumptively look at religion as being the cause of conflict and violence.
So we say that these states are necessarily secular states that has been created by colonization. Hence why they separate the Ummah, they break up the Ummah, but they use Islam for legitimacy from the people.
Yeah, legitimacy from the people, and they abuse Islam for their own ends. So wherever they need, for example, Saudi Arabia justifying American bases in the country through a fatwa. So this stuff is very, very common as well, whether it be Egypt or the Sheikh Al-Azhar saying something, justifying something that Mubarak's doing. what Sisi is doing, and so yeah, I think that's a fair characterization.
But wouldn't that be the same as in any other non-Muslim state, that they use Islam and some of the scholars who are close to the government to legitimize the state positions too?
What do you mean? Like, do you mean classically speaking, even in the
And I'm talking about
old caliphates, or do you mean
like today,
yeah?
we have a lot of do you see that happening, that even in non-Muslim states there will be some Islamic leaders who work closely with the government and that are used to legitimize government's policies?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a sort of microcosm of a similar approach to what happens in the Muslim world, with slightly different parameters and dynamics, but definitely, and that in a way that undercuts some of the apparent claims of the secular approach, where you should not be mixing government policy and religion in this manner. But they do, because in the end, it's what matters for them is the interests, not the basic principles. But yes, this happens a lot, where the government, with American, UK, France takes it to the next level. They actually some years ago came up with an idea where they were going to have a Imams Council selected and approved by the government. But this type of approaches happen everywhere, even in Australia. And John Howard tried to do this very explicitly, as you might recall. So yeah, this is why we're always advising some of our leadership councils to be wary of this fact, that although what you're doing is engagement from a perspective to secure legitimate Muslim interests, the stronger player, which is the government in this case, and state institutions, have a whole different plan in mind, and they've got a lot more leverage than you do to achieve their ends than you do to achieve your ends. So that dynamic is there, and it's an ongoing discussion and debate within Muslim communities in the West.
So given that we are part of an ummah and living in a whole international system that demands secularization, and that is premised on secularism, going back to the discussion on Palestine, what should we expect of Muslim leaders, and what should we do? What are the things that we can do? So one from what should we expect of the leaders, and what should we do?
Look, obviously this is a difficult question, and there's room for debate and discussion on this. My sense would be that we need to work at two levels, and this is not just on Palestine. We have a number of areas in the entire Muslim world has its problems, but certain areas are, let's say, on fire. So I think we need to work on two areas. One is a longer term strategy, and that's where we have to have a permanent focus, a sort of consistent focus, because that's where the root causes are going to be addressed, and that's where the more comprehensive solution is going to arise, which is to wrest power in the Muslim world for a sincere Islamic leadership and for the Ummah. Right? So the Ummah can project its power along Islamic mandates and lines. At the same time, you can't sacrifice short-term requirements just because, by saying that, we're working for a long-term solution. So the second area, which a lot of times becomes the first, is to do what you can within the limitations you have of the present scenario. So, for example, right now in Gaza, there are various things we can do, and that the Ummah is doing various types of economic boycotts, various types of pressurizing local politicians, international bodies, and pushing the leaders to do something. I think all of that has a place, but so long as you appreciate that that's not where the actual longer term healing or solution is going to come from. So I think it's important to do that, because if you don't, then all you're doing is firefights. You're just playing the role of a firefighter, Palestine, and then the Uyghurs, and then Iraq, and then Afghanistan, and then you're back in Palestine again, and that's crazy as an approach. And this is why I'm saying, and really what Palestine should emphasize for us now, after what we've seen, the intensity of what we've seen in the last two and a half months, is that really every Muslim movement, organization, institution should be playing some role in that consistent longer-term effort for the Ummah to rest its political destiny, right? And I say something because there's not one pathway, there's not one thing that needs to be done. There are multiple things, right? But that it is a particular space. It does require particular types of actions, right? So everyone needs to be doing something there, but at the same time, we can all mobilize in a more direct manner to do with particular fires and do some of that firefighting as and when required.
So one last question. What would be your message to someone who is interested to learn a bit more about the Ummah and how the Ummah can come together? What should they do, and how can they move forward?
There's a lot of things that can be done. Depending on the person. People are in different contexts. Young people versus older people, academics, scholars, and individuals. I suppose for the let's say we take the example of the young lay Muslim who is beginning to or has some participation in the Islamic community, in the Muslim communities. I think the starting point, perhaps as always, is increasing someone's knowledge base on these issues, learning more. And so I would encourage people to, in fact, even before that, it's the will. It's really the will and saying, look, I want to adopt this issue. I'm not just an observer. So the first step that I would recommend for any young Muslim or older Muslim who wants to, who sees what's happening and wants to do more, is to adopt the issue, take responsibility and say, I want to own this and see what I can do. And the next step I would advise is to increase in your knowledge, because we want to act on the basis of knowledge and not on the basis of ignorance. So this is where we can read on different topics, and there's various topics, and you can, come up with some sort of plan where you're going to read different things. But for example, if it's on Palestine, if that's the issue that is going to kick you off, that's perfectly fine. Read about the history of Palestine, right? Read about, I think history is a great place to start, because it broadens your horizons in so many ways. But if we're looking also not just at particular problem spots or particular issues, but also as you said, that the Ummah and what can be done, then we want to also read on this area. And here there's lots of stuff to read. There's a lot of good work that's been done by various Islamic movements, Islamic thinkers and scholars. As someone involved in Ummatics, one thing I would recommend is that our website has got a lot of material that can be perused. But I would also recommend reading more widely from stuff that other scholars have written. And there's so many here. And I don't like leaving it in the abstract, but I can't think off the top of my head where what we could sort of recommend as a starting point. But various scholars come to mind, like Sayyid Qutb and Mawdudi, and a lot of the scholars in the Ikhwan, Sheikh Taqi al-Nabhani, the founder of Hizb al-Tahrir. And then there's other academic scholars, Sheikh Naqib al-Attas, based in Malaysia, who's done a lot of good work. So I think there's a lot of things. And in our age, in the Google age, And now in the age of ChatGPT, I don't think it's hard to come across those resources. That's why I said the first step is really the will to move from observer, to move from concerned observer to concerned participant. If you make that mental move, the rest, and obviously dua is always important. The rest is just details. It's really not hard to reach out to people who are in that space. I'm always have people always send me messages on Facebook and Twitter. I'm more than happy to respond. But it's not just me. There's many people who are working in this space. Do a bit of research, reach out to relevant people, and they'll be more than happy to guide you in terms of readings, in terms of what they can do, how they can get involved, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much, Dr. Uthman Badar. It's been an enlightening discussion for me, and feel like I've just gone through the whole enlightenment project. So I appreciate the time that you spent and the knowledge that you shared with us. So thank you so much. Inshallah, we meet again soon, inshallah.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. And good thing we just finished and someone has decided to start cutting their grass. So apologize for that, but it was an enjoyable discussion, and may Allah Ta'ala keep our intentions pure and count this for us on the Mizan in the Akhirah. Barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.